Morning, students. We have not been meeting for quite a long period of time, but I want to now give you some lessons in the form of video in the platform so that you may be able to open and go through it. The other time I posted for you a video about chemical weathering. I expect you to go and open and read, or if you have already opened and read it, please listen to the video lesson and also read, complement it together with the notes. In our today's lesson, we are going to study about biological weathering. Sometimes we call it biotic weathering. This is a form of weathering which is brought about by the interaction between living organisms such as plants and animals and other microorganisms with rocks, and in the process of interaction with these rocks they bring about the disintegration or breakdown of the rocks into progressive smaller and smaller particles. For example, just as a matter of illustration, when plants grow and penetrate their roots through the rock cracks, and as they continue to enlarge in size as they grow, they can shatter this rock into pieces. There are some animal products, animal waste products like urine, which contains acid, which can bring about the dissolving of some rocks. There are also some other animals, for example, animals that live in the soil. For example, we have rats, we have warthogs and moles. These animals, as they eat their tunnels under the ground, they end up disintegrating the rocks. So this is primarily what we shall expect under this type of weathering. Now, how does biological weathering operate? How does biological weathering operate? So we shall look at the processes or the operation of biological weathering in three different dimensions. First of all, we shall look at the role of plants in biological weathering. Then we shall also look at the role of animals in biological weathering. Then thirdly, we shall look at the role of man, the role played by man in biological weathering. So in this case, we would have completed the processes of the occurrence of biological weathering. Now, dear students, without wasting time, let's go straight to the roles played by plants or the actions of plants in as far as biological weathering is concerned. First of all, plants, as they grow, they produce roots. Now, when these roots penetrate through cracks and crevices within the rocks, and as the roots continue to enlarge, penetrate and enlarge in the rock cracks and in the soil, they end up breaking this rock. They end up enlarging the cracks, and in the process of enlarging continuously the cracks, the rocks will end up breaking down into smaller and smaller fragments. So in this case, we say that biological weathering has taken place because of the actions of plant roots. Then secondly, we shall also look at some plant roots which can produce acids, or they exude acids, organic acids, at their tips. These acids are natural organic acids which enable the roots to grow. It enables the acids to dissolve some of the resistant rocks so that they can be able to penetrate through it. Now, this organic acid produced by the plant roots can bring about the dissolution of some soluble rocks, And in the process, these rocks are broken down into smaller and smaller fragments. So in this case, we say biological or biotic weathering has taken place. Thirdly, still under the role of plants in as far as biological weathering is concerned, we also look at some plants. I hope you, in your observation, you must have seen some plants growing directly on the surfaces of certain rocks. And these are mainly plants like lichens and mosses. Lichens, mosses, and algae. These are various types of plants which can grow directly on the surface of rocks. They spread themselves over the rock surfaces. Now, just like any other living organisms, these plants can generate water on the rock surfaces. And as they produce water on the rock surfaces, this water will help to accelerate the rate of chemical weathering produced by other processes of chemical weathering. So in this case, these algae and the mosses and the lichens act as motivators. They motivate, encourage the process of chemical weathering on the rock surfaces, because the presence of water accelerates chemical weathering of the rocks. Then lastly, still under the action of plants in biotic weathering, we shall look at the role of the decomposition of remains of plants. When plant leaves drop down on the ground, or some plants have been cut down, including grass, then they die and decompose. And in the process of decomposition, they produce what we call humic acid. Humic acid is a very powerful acid which can bring about decomposition or breakdown or dissolution of certain soluble rocks. So in this case, we actually attribute the occurrence of certain type of weathering to the action of decomposition of plant roots and plant leaves and some branches of the trees which have been cut and down. For your information, this form of weathering is very popular in the tropical rainforest areas, where there is a production of large amount of leaf litter over the floor of the tropical rainforests, which continuously decompose. And in the process of decomposing, they actually continue to produce the humic acid, and eventually it brings about extensive weathering and decomposition of rocks in the tropical rainforest areas. So those are the four major ways in which plant can bring about the occurrence of biological weathering. Now, still under the processes of biological weathering, we shall look at the roles of animals, roles played by animals in the biological weathering processes. Animals, in summary, can bring about biological weathering in so many ways. For example, we have the burrowing animals. Burrowing animals are animals which live under the ground. We have animals which produce waste matter, which waste matter can also bring about decomposition of rocks and so many others. So in detail, how does the animals play a role in biological weathering? Number one, burrowing animals. These are animals, as I said earlier on, which live under the ground. They drill tunnels under the ground. For example, we have animals like moles, we have rats, we have squirrels. These animals produce underground tunnels, and these underground tunnels will facilitate easy movement of water under the ground. And it makes the underground areas to become aerated. In other words, it facilitates free movement of air under the ground. And you remember, both air and water are very important aspects of chemical weathering. So in other words, the burrowing animals which produce the tunnels under the ground accelerate the rate of chemical weathering, and they make chemical weathering to occur deeper under the ground. Secondly, we have the role played by some birds. There are certain birds which dig caves on rock surfaces. For example, we have the pidocks, which drill holes on the rocks. Now, as they drill holes on the rocks, these holes will facilitate accumulation of water on the rocks. And the more water accumulates on the rocks, the more chemical weathering will operate. So in this case, some of these animals which produce holes on the rocks will produce chemical weathering processes. Then the piddock shells also drill into the rocks for protection purposes, basically. But in the process, they release acids in order to bring about the dissolving of these rocks. The piddocks produce acids in order to facilitate a rapid production of the holes on the rocks. So in the process, they end up breaking down the rocks into smaller and smaller fragments. We also have the roles played by still burrowing animals in the weathering processes. The roles played by burrowing animals like moles, rodents, rats, and squirrels. These animals can facilitate physical movement of the broken rock pieces. For example, in the process of digging down the holes and the tunnels under the ground, they break these rocks. And as they break these rocks, they physically remove the rock fragments from under the ground onto the surface. If you have been very observant as you walk over the landscape in some other areas, you will find that some soils in areas heavily invested by these animals like rocks, you will find some soils have been brought from under the ground onto the surface. So those are the roles these burrowing animals can bring about in the biological weathering processes. They dig the tunnels under the ground physically, and they move these rock particles physically to the surface. So in other words, they end up even exposing these rock fragments at the surface for further weathering processes to act upon. So in this case, we say that the burrowing other animals facilitate rapid occurrence of weathering processes of rocks. Then still under the role played by plants in as far as the weathering process is concerned, we shall look at the roles of certain worms. For example, we look at the roles of earthworms. We shall look at the roles played by ants. We shall look at the roles played by termites, the roles played by spiders and snails. These worms and insects are very active agents of especially biological weathering. They also dig tunnels under the ground, and these tunnels facilitate easy passage of water and air under the ground. So in other words, the tunnels made by the worms, the earthworms, the termites, and the spiders can make deep percolation of water and air under the ground. And you remember, air and water are very important agents of chemical weathering. So in this case, these animals would facilitate and increase the rapid occurrence of chemical weathering, deep occurrence of chemical weathering under the ground, and deep rock rotting. Next, we also shall look at still the role of burrowing animals For example, rodents, the rabbits, and the reptiles in the process of weathering of parent rocks. These burrowing animals still mix up the soils and improve the aeration under the ground, and they improve drainage. Improvement of aeration means, underground aeration means, it brings about free movement of air under the ground. These animals also improve drainage of the soil. So in other words, water can freely move under the ground. They also churn up the soil for improved drainage of the soil. So these activities of digging underground tunnels, of churning up the soils, and improving aeration and drainage bring about deep chemical weathering of rocks under the ground, because these activities makes water to deeply percolate under the ground. They also make deep movement of air under the ground, or deep circulation of air under the ground, and all this brings about deep weathering of rocks, even deeper under the ground, and deep rock decomposition. We also look at the roles played by waste products of animals. Animals produce a lot of waste products. For example, urine. Urine contains what we call uric acid. And this uric acid can bring about direct decomposition of rocks. You know, when we use the word decomposition, it is geologically accepted, so don't be worried. So the acids can bring about rock rotting and decomposition, and eventually breakdown of these rocks. So in this way, the acids found in urines of animals can bring about biological weathering. Then also, when the animals decompose after they have died, they produce also humic acid. And this humic acid, as we had looked at under in a plant, humic acid in the process of decomposition will bring about weathering of rocks, because they dissolve certain soluble minerals in the rocks. Besides the waste products of animals, for example, feces. These feces can also decompose, and they produce humic acid, and in the process, the humic acid brings about extensive and deep percolation and weathering of rocks under the ground. So in this case, you can really see that animals play a significant role in the process of biological weathering. Then lastly, there are certain types of bacteria which live under the ground. These bacteria live in the presence of water, and they can break down certain minerals from the soils, and in the process, they lead to rapid decomposition and breakdown of the parent rocks. Then lastly, we shall look at the role of man in the biological weathering processes. Man plays significant role in biological weathering in the following ways. The man plays several activities. For example, the action of mining, constructions, works like construction of roads and construction of buildings, houses. In the process of the mining under the ground, you have to break rocks. In the process of construction of roads, you have to break the what? You have to break certain types of rocks. So in this case, man contributes greatly in the process of biological weathering of certain types of rocks. Sometimes you have seen man physically getting involved in the blasting of certain rocks. In the process of rock quarrying, they blast the rocks into pieces using explosives. So therefore, we can see that man plays significant role in the process of biological weathering. Secondly, still under man, we shall see that man also gets actively in agricultural activities. And in the process of agriculture, you find maybe if there is that activity of plowing of the land, you end up breaking the what? Of the rocks which are under the ground. Then the plowing of the land can also bring about aeration of the underground soils. So it will enable deep movement of water under the ground. And this can bring about deep weathering of the rocks and deep rock rotting of rocks under the ground. Then lastly, we shall also look at the role of man in producing waste products such as urine and feces. The urine of man contains uric acid, which directly lead to decomposition of certain types of soluble rocks. There are also waste products like feces can decompose and produce humic acid, which humic acid is capable of bringing about decomposition of certain types of soluble rocks. So in this case, we can see that man has contributed, or man contributes greatly in the process of biological weathering. So my dear students, I want to thank you very much for following up this lesson. We shall continue with this kind of video lesson until the topic of weathering is over. Then if there is a need to have a video lesson, physical direct video lesson, live video lesson, I will still make arrangement with you. Otherwise, thank you very much. Please continue to study and take good care of yourselves as you wait for the schools to reopen. Have a blessed day.